Florida Island, Solomons, dawn, January 1943. Moist heat clung to the jungle ridge as a grey, exhausted sky bled into the horizon. The first tremor of engines vibrated across the makeshift airstrip carved between palms and mud-soaked trenches. Mechanics moved like silhouettes, slow, deliberate, burdened by fatigue, working beneath lanterns that sputtered against the humidity. Far out over Iron Bottom Sound, a low rumble of distant artillery rolled in like a reminder that nothing here ever truly slept. The P-38 Lightning stood at the edge of the field, their twin booms glistening under the weakening night, steam rising from metal that had already begun warming in the tropical air. They looked alien among the clutter of single-engine fighters, larger, heavier, angular machines with double propeller arcs that sliced the dawn in two. Every arrival of a Lightning drew glances from nearby units, to some, curiosity, to others, doubt. Whispers traveled through the camp, too big, too heavy, wrong for turning fights, a gamble the Pacific didn't need. Major Richard Dick Bong moved around the left nacelle of his aircraft, boots sinking into the wet grit. His gloves brushed metal still cold from the night. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The noise of engines warming, tools striking aluminum panels, and the distant mutter of radio checks filled the morning like a thick mechanical fog. The ground quivered again as another Lightning throttled up, its turbo-supercharged whine echoing off the tree line in a rising, metallic wail. Across the water, beyond the haze, Rabaul's intelligence rooms were stirring. In dim, smoke-filled operations huts, Japanese commanders studied intercepted reports and reconnaissance sketches. They had seen the twin-engine American fighter before. Their verdict was simple and dismissive, a heavy bomber escort that lacked agility, a flawed design that would crumble in tight combat. In the Solomons, where turning duels decided life in seconds, no one believed the Lightning could survive, let alone win. The Americans on the ground didn't speak of that. They only spoke about distance, long, unforgiving miles stretching north toward Bougainville. They spoke about fuel burn, superchargers overheating, the unpredictable storms that hid inside the clouds like traps. And they spoke about how thin the line had become. Japanese Zeros still controlled the air north of the islands, and every patrol felt like walking into a steel net that tightened with each mile. At 6:18, the radio tower crackled under the wet static. An incoming scout reported a force lifting off from Kahili. Multiple bogies, climbing, heading south. The words dissolved into static, but they were enough. Crew chiefs moved faster. Ammunition belts slammed into gun bays. Fuses clicked. Fuel lines were tightened. The Lightnings drank avgas with deep metallic gulps, the smell drifting heavy across the runway. Bong climbed into the cockpit, the canopy frame cold against his palms. He slid into the seat, feeling the harness straps stiff from yesterday's sweat. The instrument panel glowed faintly, fogged around the edges. A thin line of condensation trickled down the gunsight glass. As the right engine caught, a violent shudder rolled through the aircraft, then stabilized into a stable, rising hum. Turbochargers spooled up in a ghost-like whine that blurred into the morning wind. To the west, another Lightning, flown by Captain Thomas Lynch, rolled from its revetment, leaving a trail of dust swirling like smoke behind its tail. Lynch kept his head low, jaw clenched, scanning the sky through the canopy. Even from a distance, his posture carried a quiet pressure, one born from battles fought at altitudes where the air tore at metal and lungs alike. At 6:32, the first Lightnings taxied onto the strip. Bong's cockpit trembled with every pebble under the tires. Trees leaned inward on both sides of the runway like watching figures. Far ahead, heat shimmered off the dirt surface, distorting the edge of the jungle. The tower's voice, muted but urgent, cut across the field. Enemy formation confirmed. Estimated 40+. Altitude climbing. The words tightened every muscle in every pilot on the line. Bong advanced the throttles. The engines roared, two mechanical beasts pulling against the brakes. The vibration seeped into his boots, his spine, his jaw. Then he released the brakes. The Lightning surged forward, gathering speed fast despite its massive frame. Wind hammered the canopy. The jungle blurred. The runway vanished beneath him in a rising howl of power until the wheels lifted free. The sudden weightlessness felt like stepping off a cliff. The formation gathered over the coast, climbing steadily into a sky streaked with thin clouds and rising heat. Far below, the water reflected the early sun like molten glass. Bong scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the glare. Nothing. Only the tremor of engines and the faint shadow of the trailing aircraft holding formation. Then, faintly, a flash of movement far ahead. Lynch's voice cracked through the radio, sharp, controlled. Contact. Hi. 11 o'clock. Dark specks emerged from the bright sky, multiplying, spreading, descending like a swarm. Zeros. Dozens of them, peeling into attack lines. The lightnings kept climbing. The distance closed. The sky thinned. The pressure deepened, stretching across Bong's chest, pressing into the metal around him. And in that tightening space between the formations, 19,000 feet above the Solomons, the aircraft that Japanese commanders mocked began turning toward the kill zone. The distance between the two formations collapsed like a tightening noose. The sunlight struck the Japanese fighters first, bright flashes glinting off their wingtips as the Zeros angled down in long, predatory arcs. They moved with fluid precision, each turn smooth, each dive coordinated, lines of motion converging into a deadly funnel meant to shear through anything that dared climb toward them. Bong's lightning didn't turn. It kept rising. Turbochargers howled behind him, redlining with a metallic shriek that vibrated through the canopy frame. The nose trembled, and his altimeter needle edged upward, creeping toward the thin layer of scattered clouds hanging like torn silk across the upper sky. Lynch's lightning slid into place at Bong's right, the twin engines of his aircraft pulsing through the air with deep, rhythmic pressure waves that merged with Bong's in a steady, pounding cadence. Below them, the Zeros tightened their attack line. The first dive came fast. A slashing descent from high off the left side, sun behind them, wings shimmering white, silhouettes sharpening into deadly clarity. Tracers bloomed early, streaking upward like thin red needles ripping past the lightning's noses. Bong angled slightly, just enough to slip the incoming line, then pushed throttle to the stops. The twin Allison engines roared in response, their combined thrust sending the lightning into a steep surge of acceleration no Zero could match. Air screamed across the canopy. The Zeros overshot. They corrected immediately, widening their turn to come around again, but the separation had changed. The lightnings were no longer targets beneath them. They were rising predators, climbing into a realm where speed, not maneuverability, ruled the fight. Lynch's aircraft shuddered into a shallow dive. He slid out of formation, using the momentum of the earlier engagement to build airspeed. His lightning's twin tails carved a clean arc against the sky as he rolled inverted, then snapped into a high-speed pass aimed directly at a second set of Zeros approaching from the east. The formation leader saw him, too late. Lynch fired a short, brutal burst. 5 streams of .50 caliber fire walked across the Zero's fuselage. The aircraft folded inward, flame blooming from its engine before it spiraled downward in a black smear of smoke. The Japanese line hesitated. The Americans did not. Bong pulled upward into a vertical climb, using the lightning's raw horsepower to break away from the swirling mess of opening maneuvers. The nose pointed nearly straight into the sun. His vision blurred with the sudden G-load. Sweat stung his eyes. The lightning bucked once as it pushed through a pocket of rough air, but then it was above the Zero swarm. That was all he needed. He rolled the aircraft over the top and dove. Gravity took hold like an iron hook. The lightning accelerated in an instant, engine screaming as it knifed through the air, the dive so steep it felt like falling through open space. The Japanese fighters below flickered in and out of view, small, darting shapes twisting in synchronized chaos. Bong focused on one breaking to the right, trying to climb. A fatal mistake. The P-38's guns lit up. A hard, flashing line of fire cut across the Zero's fuselage. Panels burst outward. A wingtip snapped off in a spray of debris. The aircraft flipped violently before plunging toward the ocean far below, trailing smoke that thinned into the morning haze. Bong didn't watch it fall. He rolled into another dive the moment the kill registered, diving again through the Japanese formation. Below, the battle expanded. 24 aircraft now twisted above the Solomons, each one carving white scars into the sky. The sound of engines reverberated through the thin air, deep lightning roars mixed with the sharper, rasping whine of the Zeros as more enemy fighters streamed south from Bougainville. The sky was filling fast, the combat spreading into a layered storm of metal and vapor. Lynch broke hard left to evade a Zero sliding onto his tail. His lightning's wingtip scraped the edge of a cloud, trailing mist that curled into the aircraft's slipstream. The Zero followed, cutting inside the turn. Lynch snapped the throttles forward and punched the dive brakes, forcing the lightning into a sudden slowdown mid-roll, the maneuver jerking his harness so violently it bit into his chest. The Zero shot past him. Lynch fired. The burst struck the enemy fighter in the belly. It detonated in a flash of white flame, debris scattering into the void. But there was no time to savor the reprieve. Bong's voice crackled across the radio, short, sharp, breath-tight. Multiple incoming. High, north side. He could see them. A second wave of Zeros, nearly 20 strong, diving from above cloud level. Their descent was disciplined and terrifyingly precise, one long, surgical blade falling toward the Lightning formation. The Americans climbed to meet them, but even with the P-38's power, the altitude gap was lethal. The Zeros hit like a hammer. Bong caught only fragments, streaks of metal, shadows rushing past, the thud of tracer lines slicing into the air near his right boom. One Lightning below him erupted in flame, rolling inverted as its pilot bailed out. Parachute silk flashed bright white against the dark plume of burning fuel. Lynch pulled a tight climbing spiral and fired upward to disrupt the descending swarm, but the sky was becoming a maze, too many fighters, too many directions, too much chaos. And yet, in the maelstrom, the Lightnings kept fighting upward, turning every climb into a weapon. But the Japanese commanders watching from Rabaul had not expected this. Their pilots had not expected this. The men who dismissed the Lightning as clumsy were watching the opposite unfold, speed and altitude turning the twin-engine fighter into a blade cutting straight into their elite squadrons. And the battle was about to tilt even further. For above the second wave, beyond the scattering clouds, another formation was rising into the fight. The third formation emerged from the fractured cloud layer like dark shards slipping out of the sun. Their silhouette stretched across the glare, 30, maybe more, diving in a staggered cascade that fanned across the upper sky. It was the kind of descending curtain that once signaled inevitability, the moment when weight of numbers alone crushed resistance. But this time, the Lightnings were already climbing into them. Bong felt the sudden shift in the air pressure as he rose past 22,000 feet. The sky thinned, cold seeped through the metal, and the canopy edges frosted with the faintest silver haze. The Lightning's engines groaned under the strain but held, steady, fierce, controlled. He kept the nose angled just beneath stall, squeezing every ounce of altitude out of the climb. Below and around him, the battle churned, a chaotic sprawl of twisting contrails and scattered wreckage drifting slowly downward through the layers of blue. The new Zero formation broke into attack lines, their wings catching the sun in brief, sharp flashes. They spread into 3 descending arcs, one to cut the Lightnings from above, one to force them downward, and a third to pin them between the two. It was a coordinated kill pattern, the same maneuver that had ripped apart American units months earlier. But this time, the target was not Wildcats or P-40s. It was a machine that climbed faster, dove harder, and carried twice the firepower. Bong reached the top of his arc, rolled hard left, and inverted into a precision dive. His harness slammed against his ribs as gravity seized him. The Lightning accelerated instantly. The sky blurred into a streaked tunnel of sunlight and shadow. He aimed for the center arc of Zeros, those mid-dive, committed, unable to break without losing formation cohesion. At 800 yards, he fired. The Lightning's nose guns erupted in a concentrated roar, 5 streams converging into one blinding line of fire that cut upward through the Japanese formation like a heated blade. The first Zero disintegrated. The second rolled violently as rounds tore through its tail. The third sheared away in a burst of vapor and flame, trailing black smoke as it dropped through the layers of combat below. Bong didn't wait to see the impact. He rolled out of the dive, plunged deeper into the chaos, and used the Lightning's speed to streak clear of the counterattack. Above him, Lynch was already engaging. He had positioned his Lightning off the high right side of the descending formation, climbing the last few hundred feet of altitude with a slow-burning patience that belied the urgency of the fight. When he reached firing position, he pushed the throttles forward, and the Lightning lunged into a shallow dive. Lynch opened fire. A Zero at the edge of the formation shattered under the burst, pieces spinning away like burning paper. Lynch continued firing as he passed through the formation, his tracers stitching across the sky, forcing the Japanese pilots to scatter. The coordinated dive dissolved into fragments as Zeros broke off, twisting away, diving hard, anything to escape the killing arcs of the twin-engine fighters that were never supposed to reach this altitude. But one Zero rolled into his tail. Its nose dipped, then rose again as the pilot corrected, settling into Lynch's wake. Tracers flashed past the Lightning's right boom. Lynch felt the aircraft shudder. One round struck metal, another pinged off the rear fuselage. He punched the throttle forward, pulling the Lightning into a steep climb. The Zero followed. Its engine strained, its propeller biting thin air, but it kept coming, slowly, stubbornly, like a shadow welded to Lynch's tail. Lynch banked right, holding his climb, waiting for the moment the Lightning's superior power would create separation. 10 seconds. 15. The Zero began to fall behind. Lynch rolled over the top and dove. The Zero couldn't follow. It dropped away, stalling briefly at the crest, and in that instant Lynch came down with a precision strike. His guns cut through the Zero's left wing route, tearing the aircraft apart mid-roll. Debris spiraled past Lynch's canopy, fragments tapping against the metal like brittle knuckles. Below the engagement, the battle expanded again. More fighters were drifting south from Bougainville, reinforcements, desperate attempts to regain control of the sky that had once belonged unquestionably to them. The Japanese commanders in Rabaul were receiving real-time fragments of reports: foreign twin-engine fighters overpowering elite units, impossible climb rates, heavy losses, unknown tactics. And still the Lightnings climbed. Bong leveled out at 24,000 feet. The temperature here was punishing. Icy air seeped through every seam in the cockpit, fogging the inner canopy edges and making his hands numb inside his gloves. His breath rasped inside the oxygen mask, each inhale clipped by the thinness of the air. But he held position, scanning the skies above for the next wave. He didn't have to wait. A lone Zero, separated from its formation, was climbing toward him. The pilot was skilled: tight turns, smooth throttle modulation, no wasted motion. He climbed diagonally, trying to force Bong into a level turn where the Zero's agility could dominate. Bong refused the bait. He pulled the Lightning upward, into a near-vertical climb. The Zero followed. Both aircraft clawed into the high sky, engines screaming, metal trembling under strain. At the crest, the Lightning nearly stalled. Bong felt the nose lose lift. The aircraft wobbled. He pushed the left rudder and rolled. The Lightning slid sideways off the top of the climb, an unnatural, abrupt motion no Zero could mimic. Gravity seized the aircraft, pulling it into a steep, slicing dive that lined up perfectly with the Zero now struggling at the peak of its climb. Bong fired one burst. The Zero exploded. A bloom of fire and shredded aluminum fell away into the abyss below, spinning slowly as gravity reclaimed it. The sky around him was changing. The Japanese formations were unraveling. Smoke trails marked the downward path of fallen fighters. The Lightnings still flying were climbing again, preparing for another strike, their engines echoing across the upper atmosphere with deep, pulsing resonance. This was no longer simply an air battle. It was a dismantling. And the Japanese command staff, watching through fractured radio reports, were only starting to understand that the aircraft they mocked was erasing their elite pilots from the sky. The battle's echoes stretched across the upper sky as the surviving Zeros scattered into the thinning haze, their formations fractured beyond recognition. Some dove low, desperate to regroup. Others climbed in broken, futile arcs, lungs burning through failing oxygen as they tried to regain altitude dominance that no longer existed. The Lightnings held the heights now, those cold, shimmering altitudes where speed ruled, and where every Zero that ventured upward arrived already half defeated. Bong leveled off at 23,000 feet, the Lightning's engines rumbling through the control column like a slow, steady heartbeat. Beneath him, contrails drifted in thin, unraveling strips. Debris trails twisted downward through the blue. The haze over the Solomons pulsed faintly with distant flashes of artillery reflecting off the sea. For a moment, the fight seemed suspended, motionless, held in the aftershock of its own violence. But the battle was not over. Not yet. A final group of Zeros, 7, maybe 8, were rising through the scattered cloud deck, climbing in a staggered line from the northeast. These were not the reckless early attackers. Their formation was tight, precise. They ascended with practiced discipline, engines pushing against the thin air with steady determination. These were some of the best pilots Rabaul still had, veterans of China, Malaya, and the early Pacific sweeps. Men who knew survival in the sky came not from instinct but from control, patience, and unity. Bong adjusted his heading, dipping his left wing just enough to signal the shift. Lynch, circling 2,000 feet below, banked upward to join him. Two more Lightnings, one scarred by tracers, another trailing a thin line of vapor from a hit to its left boom, pulled into climbing arcs to support. Their silhouettes rose like twin-armed phantoms through the thinning clouds. The Japanese formation reached 21,000 feet. The Lightnings descended. Not in a dive, not yet, but in a controlled, deliberate glide, engines throttled back just enough to mask their closing speed. Their twin shadows stretched beneath them as the sun angled behind their tails, turning the P-38s into dark, descending shapes almost indistinguishable against the glare. The Japanese pilots saw them seconds later. The formation compressed, tightening instinctively. They angled upward, preparing to meet the attack head-on, banking on the Zero's unmatched roll rate and turn radius to counter whatever came. But this time, the advantage was gone before the clash began. The Lightnings had altitude, speed, and the sun. Bong pushed his throttles forward. The dive began. The Lightning surged, shaking slightly as it sliced through thinning air. The sky flashed around him, cloud vapors tearing past, shafts of sunlight cutting across the canopy, the faint shimmer of heat distortion trailing behind the engines. The Zero formation rushed upward, filling his gun sight in a blur of coordinated motion. At 500 yards, Bong fired. A tight, controlled burst, no more than a second. The line of fire struck the lead Zero's engine cowling. It erupted into flame, spinning away as the pilots behind broke formation to avoid collision. That instant of fragmentation was enough. Bong rolled right, diving through the gap, forcing the Japanese pilots to split, their tight cohesion dissolving into scattered arcs. Lynch came down behind him. He picked a Zero turning hard left, pushing the Lightning into a shallow roll to match its angle. The Zero tightened the turn, sharp, precise, flawless, but the Lightning didn't try to follow. Lynch climbed instead, arcing above the turn, using altitude to pivot into a descending shot. He fired at the moment the Zero crossed beneath him, shells ripping into its right wing. The aircraft buckled, trailing a spiraling ribbon of black smoke. The remaining Japanese pilots fought with fierce, unyielding resolve. They dove, climbed, turned in perfect formations of 2 or 3, each covering angles the others could not. For a moment, the air burned with a brief resurgence of tactical brilliance, a display of skill, precision, and survival instinct sharpened by years of combat. But the Lightnings were machines built for a new kind of fight. One dove from above, its engine screaming through the upper air as it cut across a Zero rolling onto Bong's tail. Another Lightning swung wide, pulling a long, sweeping arc that forced a pair of Japanese fighters into evasive separation. Every second, the Americans leveraged speed and altitude, not turn radius. Every second, the Zeros found themselves climbing, losing energy, running out of sky. Bong lined up another shot. A Zero attempted to spiral climb into his blind spot, classic tactic, deadly in the right conditions, but Bong had altitude to burn. He pulled upward, stalled the aircraft deliberately for a fraction of a heartbeat, then dropped the nose. The Lightning fell through the spiral path like a falling blade. He fired a single, precise burst. The Zero vanished in a blossom of fire. The last Japanese fighter dove for the lower clouds, engine roaring, bullets flashing from its cowl. Lynch pursued, keeping the Lightning tight behind, throttles firewalled. The Zero twisted violently, diving into thicker cloud layers, hoping to vanish into the vapor. But the Lightning held the path, engines shrieking as its heavy frame punched through turbulence in long, shaking gusts. The Zero emerged from the cloud layer into open air, and Lynch was already there. A short burst. White flame tore across the fuselage. The Zero's wings folded, and the aircraft spiraled downward into the ocean far below. Silence settled over the upper sky. No more contrails of incoming fighters. No more climbing formations. Only drifting smoke, scattered debris, and the distant shimmer of iron bottoms sound glinting beneath the broken clouds. One by one, the Lightning circled, engines low, forming a ragged, exhausted formation for the long flight back south. The adrenaline faded, leaving the quiet, heavy weight that always followed battles this large, the kind that took more than they ever returned. As they turned toward home, the aircrew in Rabaul received the final, fractured reports. Entire ace units missing, elite veterans gone, formations wiped out in minutes. The commanders who had once mocked the P-38 now stared at dots on their operation maps that had simply vanished. The twin-engine fighter they laughed at had erased some of the finest pilots they ever fielded. And in the fading light over the Solomons, the surviving Lightnings pushed steadily southward, engines humming like distant thunder, their shadows drifting across the waves below, quiet reminders of a sky that would never belong to the Japanese again. The war had shifted, and the machines that carried the shift were already disappearing into the horizon, leaving only a thin, lingering echo hanging in the vast, haunted air.